ChatGPT said. Eric's ship fell from the sky in the middle of the night. The burning trail behind it lit up the strange, dark blue sky of the alien planet, making the forest below look like it was on fire. Inside the ship, Eric held on tight, pressing every button he could remember from training, but nothing worked. The ship shook, alarms blared, and the air felt hot and thick. Eric closed his eyes and braced for the crash. The impact came like a punch from a giant. The ship hit the ground and slid for what felt like forever. Metal screeched, glass cracked, and things flew past Eric's face. When everything finally stopped, it was quiet except for the sound of Eric's breathing and the hiss of steam from broken pipes. Eric waited a few seconds, making sure he was still alive, and then unstrapped himself from his seat. His head hurt, and his arm was bleeding, but nothing seemed broken. He looked at the cracked window and saw only dark trees outside, swaying in the wind. He checked the ship's controls, but they were dead. The engines were cold, and the computer only showed warnings. Eric knew he was alone, far away from home and help. He tried the radio, but all he got was static. He sighed, wiped the blood from his arm, and opened the hatch. The air outside smelled strange, like wet grass mixed with something sour. Eric climbed out, holding a small light in one hand and a toolkit in the other. The forest was thick and quiet. Blue and purple plants grew everywhere, some taller than Eric. He listened for any sound but heard only the wind and the distant call of a bird. He moved slowly around the ship, checking for damage. The wing was bent, the engine was cracked, and the power core was sparking. Eric shook his head. It would not be easy to fix. He spent the next hours looking for anything that could help. He checked the emergency box and found a small amount of food, some water, and a first aid kit. He cleaned his arm and wrapped it. Then he made a quick shelter from a broken panel and tried to rest. But sleep did not come. Every sound in the forest made him jump. He thought about home and wondered if anyone knew where he was. As the sun rose, Eric got up and started working on the ship. He checked every wire, every panel, and every bolt. He made a list of what was broken and what he needed. The biggest problem was the power core. Without it, the ship would not fly. He looked at the thick trees and wondered if anything on this planet could help him. He worked for hours, lost in his thoughts, when he heard a noise behind him. He turned fast, holding a wrench in his hand. Someone was watching him from the trees. It was not human. The creature was tall and thin, with pale purple skin and big dark eyes. Its hair was long and white, falling over its shoulders like a waterfall. It wore a simple dress made of soft green cloth. Eric felt his heart race. He had heard about the Renari, the people of this planet, but had never seen one up close. The alien stepped out from behind the tree. She did not look dangerous, just curious. She looked at Eric, then at the broken ship. She said something in a language Eric could not understand. Her voice was soft and careful. Eric lowered his wrench and tried to smile. He pointed to himself and said, "Eric." Then he pointed to the ship and said, "Ship, broken." The alien watched him for a moment, then nodded. She pointed to herself and said, "Lyra." Her voice sounded gentle but sad. Eric tried to speak slowly. "Help, need parts, ship broken." He showed her a broken piece of metal, hoping she would understand. Lyra came closer, looking at the piece in his hand. She reached out and touched it, turning it over with long fingers. She looked at Eric, then pointed to the forest. Eric did not know what she meant, but he nodded. Lyra moved back into the trees and was gone. Eric stood there, not sure what to do. He waited for a while, thinking she would come back, but she did not. He went back to work, trying to fix what he could with the tools he had. Every now and then, he looked at the trees, hoping to see Lyra again. Later that day, as Eric tried to fix a panel, he heard another noise. He turned and saw Lyra standing there, holding something in her hands. It was a strange-looking piece of metal, shaped like nothing Eric had seen before. She handed it to him. Eric took it and looked at it closely. It was not from his ship, but it might work. He smiled at Lyra and said, "Thank you." Lyra gave a small smile back and sat on a fallen log, watching Eric as he worked. Over the next few days, Eric and Lyra met often. She brought him pieces she found in the forest, old metal, wires, and things he could use. Eric tried to talk to her, pointing to things and saying their names. Lyra did the same, teaching him her words. Soon they could share simple things, like food and water. Lyra showed Eric where safe plants grew and warned him about dangerous animals. Eric started to feel less alone. Lyra was different from anyone he had known, but she was kind and smart. She never laughed at his mistakes and always helped when she could. Eric liked talking to her even if they used more hands than words. He wondered why Lyra spent so much time with him. He noticed the way she watched the sky, her sad eyes, and the way she sat apart from others he sometimes saw in the distance. One night Eric saw Lyra looking at the stars. He joined her, sitting on the soft ground. He pointed to the sky and said, "Home." Lyra nodded, understanding. She pointed to her heart and said something in her language that Eric did not know, but he thought it meant she was lonely too. As days passed, Eric and Lyra became a team. They searched the wrecks of old ships hidden in the forest, hoping to find the parts Eric needed. Sometimes Lyra would hide when other Renari came close. Eric saw how they looked at her, sometimes laughing or turning away. He did not understand their words, but he understood the feeling. Lyra was different from her people, and they treated her like she did not belong. Eric wanted to help her the way she helped him. He tried to make her laugh with simple jokes and shared stories from his world. Lyra listened, her eyes bright in the firelight. She told Eric stories about her people and the stars above. Even when they could not find the words, they shared their thoughts with smiles and quiet moments. One afternoon, as Eric was working on the ship, Lyra came running from the forest. She looked scared. She spoke quickly, pointing behind her. Eric saw shapes moving through the trees. He grabbed his toolkit and motioned for Lyra to hide with him. They crouched behind the ship as two Renari guards passed by, their armor shining in the sun. Lyra held her breath, her hand trembling in Eric's. The guards searched the area, but soon moved on. After they were gone, Eric looked at Lyra. She seemed worried. Eric knew that helping him was dangerous for her. He wanted to tell her to stay away, to be safe, but he also did not want to lose his only friend. That night, Eric lay awake, thinking about the future. His ship was still broken, and now he knew that Lyra risked much to help him. He promised himself he would fix the ship, no matter how hard it was. He owed it to Lyra and to himself. As the days went on, Eric worked harder. Lyra brought more parts and ideas. Together they made progress, piece by piece. Eric knew it would still take time, but he felt hope for the first time since the crash. Lyra's kindness and courage gave him strength. The strange planet did not feel so lonely anymore. With Lyra by his side, Eric believed he could fix his ship, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to help her too. Eric woke up early, the cold air touching his face as he opened his eyes. The strange sky above was turning from dark blue to a pale gray, and the quiet sounds of the alien forest greeted him. He sat up under his makeshift shelter and stretched. His sore muscles. Every bone in his body ached from sleeping on hard ground, but he was getting used to it. He checked his ship first, like always. The hull was still cracked, but he had made some progress. Some wires were fixed, and the panels. He and Lyra had found help to cover the broken spots. But the big problem, the missing power core, was still unsolved. Without it, the ship would never fly. Eric took a piece of stale food from his emergency box and chewed slowly. His mind was already busy, thinking about what he could do next. He heard a soft sound behind him and turned to see Lyra approaching. She wore the same simple green dress and had a new scratch on her arm, probably from searching the wild places for ship parts. Lyra sat down near Eric and offered him a small fruit, blue and round. He smiled and took it, thanking her. He still remembered the first time he tried alien fruit and how sour it had tasted, but now he was used to it. Lyra seemed pleased when Eric finished it. They started their work for the day. Eric explained with gestures what part he needed. Lyra listened closely and repeated the shape with her hands. Even though their words were few, they understood each other. They decided to search for more wreckage, hoping to find something useful. The forest was full of old secrets. Sometimes Eric found broken pieces of metal buried under strange plants. Other times he found nothing at all. Lyra led the way, using her knowledge of the land to avoid dangerous places. She pointed out flowers that could sting and roots that could trip a person. As they walked, Eric tried to learn more of Lyra's words. He pointed to things and asked for their names. Lyra answered patiently, correcting him with a smile if he said it wrong. In return, Eric taught her the English names for the tools and ship parts. They laughed when Eric mispronounced her language. Or when Lyra said something funny in English, they found an old metal panel half buried in the dirt. Eric pulled it out, checking its weight. Lyra watched, her eyes bright. Eric showed her how the panel might fit on his ship, and she nodded with excitement. Together they carried it back through the thick plants. Working as a team, back at the ship, Eric worked to fit the panel in place. Lyra handed him tools and pointed out small cracks he missed. Eric was glad for her sharp eyes. He realized he worked faster when she was around, and he made fewer mistakes. Lyra was careful, never rushing, and always thinking about the next. Stepped up, after hours of hard work, they took a break. Lyra pulled out some food from a small bag. She handed Eric a piece and they ate together in the shade. Eric asked about Lyra's family, using simple words and signs. Lyra looked sad for a moment and shook her head. She drew in the dirt with a stick, showing a picture of a tall building and many smaller figures. Eric guessed that meant she lived in a big house with other Renari, but she was alone. Lyra pointed to her face and then away, as if to say the others did not want her around. Eric remembered how the guards and some Renari kept their distance from her. He wanted to make her feel better, so he smiled and said, "You are my friend." Lyra looked surprised, then happy. She said friend in English, repeating it softly as if she liked how it sounded. They spent the afternoon fixing small things on the ship. Eric taught Lyra how to use the wrench, and she learned quickly. Her hands were gentle but strong. Sometimes she came up with ideas Eric had not thought of. He listened to her, glad for any help. As the sun began to set, Lyra seemed worried. She looked around nervously, then spoke in a low voice. Eric did not understand all the words, but he heard the name Yaron. Lyra drew a simple shape in the dirt, a tall figure with a crown. Eric guessed this was her father, the Renari king. Lyra looked scared as she spoke, pointing to the ship and making a cutting motion with her hand. Eric tried to comfort her. He shook his head and said, "It's okay. I won't let anyone hurt you." He knew it was not much, but Lyra seemed thankful. She touched his arm gently, then stood up and slipped into the forest, leaving Eric to wonder what would happen if the king found out about their friendship. That night Eric worked late. The stars above shone bright, strange, and beautiful. He missed his home and his friends, but he was starting to feel that this planet was not as scary as he first thought. Lyra had made it better. He wondered what it was like to grow up always feeling left out. Eric had always had someone to talk to back home. Lyra only had him the next morning. Eric woke to the sound of voices. He hid quickly behind his ship. 3 Renari guards walked past, searching the area. Lyra was with them, but she kept her eyes down. The guards spoke in harsh tones, pointing at Eric's ship. Eric could not understand, but it was clear they did not trust humans. When the guards left, Lyra returned, her face worried. She spoke quickly, trying to explain. Eric listened, wishing he understood more. Lyra drew in the dirt again, showing a ship, then 2 figures running, and then the guards. Eric nodded, understanding the risk. They kept working on the ship, but now they were more careful. Lyra only came when it was safe. She watched for guards and signaled Eric when danger was near. Eric trusted her completely. Even when he was afraid, Lyra's courage made him feel safe. One afternoon, they found a large piece of machinery hidden in a burned-out wreck. It was heavy and hard to move, but Eric thought it might help power his ship. Lyra helped him push and pull it through the forest. They stopped often to rest, but they did not give up. When they finally got it back, Eric cheered, and Lyra laughed for the first time. They celebrated by sharing a meal. Eric told Lyra about Earth, describing the oceans and the tall cities. Lyra listened, her eyes wide with wonder. She told Eric, About the stars her people believed watched over them. Even with few words, they shared their dreams. As the days passed, Eric and Lyra became even closer. They learned to read each other's faces and moods. When Eric was tired, Lyra told him to rest. When Lyra looked sad, Eric told a joke to make her smile. They worked well together, each helping the other in small ways, but things were getting harder. The other Renari watched Lyra more closely. Eric saw the way they whispered when she passed. He hated that she was treated so badly. One day Lyra showed up with a bruise on her arm. She tried to hide it, but Eric noticed. He wanted to protect her, but he did not know how. That evening, Eric sat with Lyra as the sun set. He pointed to the stars and said, "One day I'll go home." Lyra nodded, but her eyes were sad. Eric wished he could take her with him. Away from the people who heard her, they sat in silence for a long time. Just looking at the stars, Eric felt hope and worry mixed together. He knew that fixing the ship was the only way he could help himself, and maybe help Lyra too, but he also knew that time was running out. The Renari would not let them keep working together forever. Before Lyra left, she pressed something into Eric's hand. It was a small stone, smooth and warm from her touch. Eric looked at her, confused. Lyra smiled and said, "Lucky." Eric held the stone tight. It was the first gift he had received on this planet, and he knew it meant a lot. After Lyra was gone, Eric sat alone by his ship. He thought about everything that had happened since the crash. He had lost his old life, but he had found a new friend. As he watched the strange stars, Eric made a promise to himself. He would fix his ship, and he would find a way to thank Lyra for her kindness. Whatever it took, he would not let her down. Eric woke up early, feeling the cold air on his face. He looked around and saw that Lyra was not there yet. The sun was just starting to rise, and the world around him was quiet. Eric sat beside his broken ship, thinking about the things he and Lyra had fixed so far. He was grateful for her help, but he was also worried. Each day, the work got harder. The missing power core still stood between him and a way home. He wondered if they would ever find what he needed. When Lyra arrived, she looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her steps were slow. Eric offered her a piece of fruit, but she shook her head. She sat next to him, looking at the ground. Eric wanted to ask what was wrong, but he knew Lyra sometimes found it hard to explain her feelings. He waited quietly, hoping she would tell him. After a while, Lyra spoke. She pointed toward the city in the distance and made a sad face. She spoke some words Eric didn't know, but he understood from her voice and her eyes that something bad had happened. Lyra drew in the dirt with a stick, showing a tall figure with a crown and guards with long spears. She drew herself smaller and off to the side, looking away from the others. Eric realized she was talking about her father, the king. The king did not like that Lyra was helping Eric. Eric felt worried for her, but Lyra touched his hand to show she was not afraid. She smiled a little, trying to hide her fear. Then she stood up, ready to help him again. They began their day by searching for parts. Lyra led Eric deeper into the forest than they had ever gone before. The air was thick and strange birds called from the tall trees. Lyra was quiet, always listening. Eric followed her closely, trusting her to keep them safe. After walking for a long time, Lyra stopped and pointed at something in the distance. Through the trees, Eric saw a large building covered in vines and moss. It looked old and broken. Lyra said something in her language, then pointed to the building and then to Eric's ship. Eric understood maybe there were parts inside that could help him. He nodded and smiled to show he agreed. They moved closer, keeping low and quiet. Inside the building it was dark and cold. Broken machines and piles of metal lay everywhere. Lyra looked around, then led Eric to a corner where a large power unit sat against the wall. Eric's heart jumped. This was the kind of part he needed. He got to work right away, opening the cover and checking the inside. Some of the wires were burnt, but the power core looked good. Eric smiled at Lyra, and she smiled back, looking proud. They started taking the core out of the old machine, but it was heavy and hard to move. They worked together, pushing and pulling, until it finally came free. Just as they finished, they heard a noise outside. Lyra peeked through a crack in the wall and saw 2 Renari guards walking past. She whispered for Eric to hide. They crouched behind a broken table, hearts pounding. The guards stopped and looked inside the building. For a moment, Eric thought they would be caught. But then the guards left, talking quietly to each other. When the danger passed, Lyra let out a deep breath. Eric squeezed her hand to thank her for being brave. Together, they carried the heavy power core out of the building and back toward the ship. The journey was hard, but they did not stop. They were both tired and hungry when they finally reached the crash site, but Eric felt hopeful again. Back at the ship, Eric started working with the new power core. Lyra handed him tools and cleaned the parts as he asked. Sometimes she made suggestions, pointing to places he might have missed. Eric realized Lyra was learning fast, becoming almost as good with repairs as he was. He liked having her by his side even when things got tough. As Eric worked, Lyra watched him closely. She asked questions about his world, using the few English words she knew and pointing at pictures Eric drew in the dirt. Eric told her about his family, about the city where he grew up, and about the sea he missed seeing every day. Lyra listened carefully, her eyes wide with wonder. When the sun began to set, Eric and Lyra sat together on the ground. Lyra looked at Eric and touched her face, then looked away. Eric saw she was sad. She spoke softly in her language, words Eric did not know, but he could guess what she meant. Lyra felt lonely among her people. She did not feel pretty or wanted, and the others did not respect her. Eric shook his head and tried to comfort her. "You are strong. You are brave. You are a good friend," he said slowly, using simple words. Lyra listened, tears shining in her eyes. Eric wanted her to know that she was important to him, that her kindness mattered more than looks. They spent the evening talking about dreams. Eric said he wanted to go home but did not want to leave Lyra behind. Lyra said she wanted to see other worlds, to be free from the rules of her people. Even if their words were simple, they understood each other's hearts. Suddenly they heard footsteps. Lyra jumped up, pulling Eric behind the ship. 3 Renari guards arrived, holding spears and wearing dark armor. One of them shouted Lyra's name. Lyra stood up and faced them, her hands shaking. The guards spoke angrily, telling her to return to the city and leave the human alone. Eric wanted to protect Lyra, but he knew he was outnumbered. Lyra looked at Eric, then at the guards. She spoke firmly, standing tall even though she was scared. The guards did not listen. One of them grabbed her arm and pulled her away. Eric watched helplessly as Lyra was led back toward the city. She looked back at Eric, her eyes full of worry and hope. Eric felt angry and sad. He wanted to help her, but he did not know how. He sat alone by his ship, thinking about what to do. That night, Eric could not sleep. He kept looking at the power core and the tools, but his mind was on Lyra. He missed her voice and her laugh. He thought about how brave she had been, standing up to the guards. Eric promised himself he would not give up on her. The next morning, Eric worked quickly. He finished installing the power core, checking every wire and bolt. He thought about Lyra the whole time, wondering if she was safe. He wished she would come back. As the sun climbed higher, Eric heard a noise from the forest. He turned and saw Lyra running toward him. She was out of breath and looked scared, but she was free. She hugged Eric, and he felt relief wash over him. Lyra explained as best as she could. The king had forbidden her to see Eric again, but she did not listen. She had snuck out of the palace and come back to help him. Eric was amazed by her courage. He thanked her again and promised they would find a way out together. With Lyra's help, Eric finished connecting the power core. The ship's lights flickered on and the control panel beeped. Eric smiled and let out a laugh. They were one step closer to leaving the planet. Lyra cheered, happy for their progress. But their work was not done. Eric checked the ship systems and saw they still needed one more part, a special type of crystal, to power the engine fully. Lyra thought for a moment, then told Eric about an old facility far from the city, a place that was now empty and dangerous. She said there might be a crystal there, but it would be a hard journey. Eric looked at Lyra, seeing her determination. He nodded. "Let's go," he said, trusting her. They packed some food and tools and set off toward the old facility together. The walk was long and full of dangers. Strange animals watched them from the shadows, and the ground was rough and uneven. Lyra led the way, never slowing down. Eric followed, trying to be brave like her. As the sun set, they reached the edge of a large, broken building. Lyra pointed to it and said, "Crystal." Eric nodded, ready to face whatever was inside. He knew they were a team, and together they could do anything. They walked into the darkness, side by side, ready to face the next challenge together. ChatGPT said. Eric and Lyra stood at the edge of the broken building as the last light of the day faded. The old facility looked dark and cold, covered in vines and silent except for the sound of the wind blowing through empty windows. Eric took a deep breath. He was afraid, but he did not want Lyra to see it. Lyra looked at him, her face brave, but her eyes were wide. She pointed at the entrance, then waited for Eric to go first. Inside, the air was heavy and smelled like dust and metal. Their footsteps echoed as they moved through the long, empty halls. Eric held a small light in his hand and moved slowly, looking for any sign of danger. Lyra walked behind him, careful and quiet. Sometimes she stopped to listen, her head turning as if she could hear something Eric could not. They passed old machines and piles of broken wires. Some walls were painted with strange Renari symbols, faded by time. Eric tried to read them, but he did not understand. Lyra touched one of the symbols, her finger tracing the shape. She whispered something in her language, maybe a prayer or a memory. They reached a heavy metal door that was half open. Eric pushed it with all his strength, and it moved just enough for them to squeeze through. On the other side, the room was full of strange equipment and thick cables. In the center was a tall glass container filled with glowing crystals. The crystals lit up the whole room with a soft blue light. Eric's heart raced. He had seen pictures of these crystals in his training, but he had never seen one up close. He knew the ship needed only one, but each crystal was bigger than his hand. He looked at Lyra, who nodded and stepped forward. Eric checked the room for traps, just like his training taught him. He saw thin wires on the ground and small lights on the walls. He warned Lyra to be careful. Lyra looked around and found a control panel. She pressed a few buttons and the wires on the ground retracted. Eric smiled, proud of her quick thinking. Eric reached into the glass container and carefully picked out a crystal. It was cold and heavy, and it hummed with energy. He wrapped it in cloth and put it in his bag. As he turned, he heard a loud noise outside the room. Lyra froze, her eyes wide with fear. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the halls. Eric whispered for Lyra to hide. They both found a dark corner behind some broken machines. The door to the room slammed open and 3 Renari soldiers came in, their armor shining and their faces hard. The leader shouted in Renari and the soldiers searched the room. Lyra squeezed Eric's hand, shaking with fear. Eric tried to stay calm. He hoped the soldiers would not find them. But one soldier stopped and looked straight at their hiding place. He shouted, and the others rushed over. Eric jumped up, putting himself between Lyra and the soldiers. The leader pointed a weapon at Eric and spoke angrily. Eric did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The soldiers wanted him to surrender. Lyra stood up too, her voice shaking as she spoke to the leader. She begged them to let Eric go, but they did not listen. The soldiers grabbed Eric and pulled him away from Lyra. She tried to fight them, but they pushed her back. Eric shouted her name, but the soldiers tied his hands and pulled him toward the door. Lyra ran after them, crying out for them to stop. Eric struggled, but the soldiers were too strong. They marched Eric and Lyra through the dark halls, their weapons pointed at the two of them. Eric's mind raced. He thought about the crystal in his bag and about how close he was to fixing his ship. He also worried about Lara. He knew she was in trouble because she had helped him. Outside, the night was cold. The soldiers led them through the forest, back toward the city. The lights of the city shone in the distance, but Eric did not feel safe. He looked at Lyra, who walked with her head down, silent and sad. When they reached the city gates, the soldiers brought them to a large building with tall doors. Inside, the walls were lined with gold and silver, and the floor was polished stone. At the end of the hall sat the Renari king, his face stern and proud. The king wore a crown of shining metal, and his eyes were cold. The soldiers pushed Eric and Lyra to their knees. The king stood up and spoke in a deep, strong voice. He looked at Lyra first, his words harsh. Lyra tried to explain, her voice shaking. She looked at Eric, then back at her father. The king listened but did not look kind. Eric tried to speak, but the guards held him tightly. The king said something in Renari, then pointed to the guards. They pulled Lyra to her feet and took her away. She looked back at Eric, her eyes full of tears. The guards dragged Eric to a small cell. The room was cold and empty. Eric sat on the floor, thinking about Lyra and the crystal in his bag. He worried for her. He wondered if she would be punished for helping him. Eric's mind was full of questions, and he felt helpless. Hours passed. Eric listened to the sounds outside the cell. He heard footsteps, voices, and sometimes Lyra's name. He tried to stay strong, but the fear grew inside him. He held the crystal tightly, hoping it would give him the strength to go on. Suddenly, Eric heard a quiet voice at the door. It was Lyra. She whispered his name and pushed something under the door, a small piece of metal. Eric picked it up and saw it was the key to his cell. Lyra had risked everything to help him again. Eric waited until the hall was quiet, then used the key to unlock the door. He crept through the halls, moving as quietly as he could. He found Lyra waiting near a side door. Her eyes were red from crying, but she smiled when she saw Eric. Together, they ran through the dark streets, hiding from the guards. They did not stop until they reached the edge of the city. The forest waited for them, dark and silent. Eric and Lyra moved quickly, running between the trees. They heard shouts behind them, but they did not look back. When they reached the ship, Eric was out of breath. Lyra looked exhausted. Eric checked the crystal, making sure it was safe. Then he hugged Lyra tightly, whispering thanks over and over. Lyra smiled, her face full of relief. Eric got to work right away. He installed the crystal in the engine, checking every connection. Lyra watched, her hands shaking with worry. When Eric finished, he turned the switch. The ship's lights flickered on, and the engine hummed to life. For the first time since the crash, Eric felt real hope. The ship was almost ready to fly. Lyra smiled, happy to see Eric's joy, but Eric saw worry in her eyes. She looked at the city, then at Eric. Eric knew Lyra had a choice to make. She could go back to her family and her people, or she could stay with him. He wanted her to be safe, but he also wanted her to be free. Eric told Lyra that she could choose her own path. He promised he would always be her friend, no matter what she decided. Lyra thought for a long time. She looked at the ship, at Eric, and then at the city in the distance. Finally, she took Eric's hand and smiled. She wanted to stay with him. Eric felt a deep happiness he had never felt before. Together they made plans for their escape. Eric checked the ship again and again, making sure nothing was missed. Lyra watched the forest, listening for any sign of danger. They worked through the night, side by side, ready for what would come next. As the sun began to rise, Eric looked at Lyra and felt hope. He was not alone anymore. With Lyra beside him, he knew he could face anything. Their journey was not over, but together they were stronger than ever. Eric and Lyra stood at the edge of the forest, the rebuilt ship glowing behind them. The city gates lay visible in the distance, with guards moving in patrols. They knew they had little time. Eric checked the ship's gauges one more time. All systems were green, but they still needed a clear path off the planet. Eric turned to Lyra. "Father will send ships soon," he said simply. His voice was calm but urgent. Lyra nodded, her pale purple skin shining faintly in the dawn light. She felt fear, but she also felt hope. She looked at the ship, then at Eric. She drew in the sand with her finger a picture of two figures flying away from the city. Eric understood. It was time. They moved quickly. Eric guided Lyra to a small side door under the ship's wing. He opened it and they climbed inside. Lyra helped him take one last look at the engine. Eric smiled and patted the power core. "We can do this," he said. Lyra nodded, pressing the small stone he had given her into her pocket for luck. Eric climbed into the pilot's seat and pulled the harness down over his shoulders. He reached for the controls. Lyra sat beside him, her hands on the panel. She had learned some of the basics, enough to help Eric with navigation. Eric took a deep breath and flipped the switch. The engines hummed louder and louder, and the ship shuddered as power flowed through every circuit. Outside, guards saw the glow and shouted. Eric lifted the ship slightly, clearing the ground. Lyra gripped his arm, her heart racing. Eric spoke calmly. "Hold on." He pushed forward. The ship rose higher, revealing more guards running toward them, but it moved too fast. The ground fell away as they climbed into the sky. The city below looked small and quiet. Lyra's chest tightened. She saw the palace towers, the golden walls. She thought of her father, waiting for her to return. She closed her eyes and whispered a farewell she could not say in words. Eric felt her tremble. He reached over and held her hand. They passed over the treetops and into the sky. The ship's engines roared, pushing them away from the planet's surface. Lyra pressed her forehead to the window, watching the trees shrink. Eric focused on the controls, guiding them on the correct trajectory for orbit. Suddenly, alarms sounded. The control panel flashed red. Eric frowned and checked the sensors. A fighter ship was on their tail, approaching fast. Eric cursed under his breath. Lyra looked at him with fear. Eric reached to the radio and switched frequency. "To whoever's listening, take me off this planet," he shouted. There was no answer. The fighter closed in. Eric hit a switch, and the ship lurched as defensive shields rose around it. Bright pulses of energy flashed from above as the fighter fired. Eric dived down, weaving between cloud layers. Lyra held on as the ship banked sharply. Lyra spoke softly. "Eric left?" She pointed. Eric nodded and turned the controls. The fighter followed. Eric grinned, remembering his training. He pulled up suddenly, then rolled the ship to drop behind a band of clouds. The fighter overshot and he shot forward, gaining distance. Down below, the planet's atmosphere glowed with the setting sun. Eric saw the fighter reappear and then fire again. Shields flickered under the impact. Eric's heart pounded. He whispered under his breath, "Not today." He pushed the engine to full power, sending the ship in a fast climb toward orbit. The fighter followed for a moment, but then the gravity well slowed it. Eric felt a surge of relief as they broke through the cloud layer into higher altitude. The planet's curved horizon appeared through the cockpit glass. Eric exhaled. Lyra looked at the horizon. She put her hand on Eric's shoulder. "We did it," she said. Her voice was fragile but strong. Eric smiled at her. "We did," he replied. They reached the edge of the atmosphere. Eric flicked switches to open the cabin for vacuum. Lyra closed her eyes at the first rush of cold air. Eric pulled her close. They sealed the hatch and the cabin heat stabilized. The blackness of space lay before them, dotted with stars. Eric brought the ship out of planet lock and set a course for the human fleet's last known position. Lyra watched him work, her trust in him growing stronger. She remembered how he had protected her again and again, risking his life to help her. A few hours later, they saw distant shapes, human ships. Relief washed over Eric. He radioed, "This is Eric Lane. I need help." Static, then a voice. "We see you, Lane. Hold on." Lyra grabbed Eric's hand, tears in her eyes. The human ships moved to escort them. Eric guided his ship into the docking bay of the nearest cruiser. The bay doors closed behind them, the engines powered down. Eric and Lyra sat in silence, breathing hard and feeling safe for the first time. Doors opened, and a Marine officer ran in. He helped Eric unstrap and looked at Lyra. He spoke on his radio. "We have civilian on board." Eric nodded. The officer turned to Lyra with a gentle smile. "Welcome," he said. Eric and Lyra walked down the bay ramp. Eric's legs felt weak, but he stood tall for Lyra. The officer led them to a small room with windows looking out into space. Eric saw abandoned drifts of asteroids and glowing nebula. Lyra looked around, wide-eyed. Eric squeezed her hand. Your choice, he sighed. You can go anywhere. Lyra looked at the stars, then back at Eric. She took a breath and said simply, with you. Eric's heart soared. He led her to the view window. They watched the planet get smaller until it was a blue dot. Eric held Lyra close. He whispered, We're free. Lyra smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Together they faced the endless stars, ready for their new life. Part 6. Eric sat in the pilot's seat as the ship hummed with power. Lyra stood behind him, watching the blinking lights on the control panel. The stars outside the viewport shone bright and clear. Eric felt a mix of excitement and fear. He turned and smiled at Lyra. It's time, he said softly. Lyra nodded, her long white hair floating in the zero gravity as she climbed into the passenger seat. She looked nervous but determined. She put her hand on Eric's shoulder. Together, she whispered. Eric reached for the throttle and pushed it forward. The engines roared and the ship moved away from the human cruiser. Behind them, the planet Renara grew small. The distant rings of clouds and blue seas faded as they climbed higher. Eric and Lyra were finally free. Minutes passed in silence as Eric guided the ship through space. Lyra watched the console, learning every move Eric made. She placed her hand on the screen, trying to remember the symbols for the stars. Suddenly, alarms blared. Eric looked at the sensor readout. A squadron of Renari fighter ships had tracked them. They were closing fast. Eric's heart pounded. Lyra, he said, we have trouble. Lyra's eyes widened. She pointed to the view screen where tiny ships appeared against the black sky. Eric flipped switches to raise the shield, but the fighters opened fire. Beams of energy struck the shield, making it ripple. Eric turned the ship with skill he had practiced for years. The fighters followed, weaving between them. Lyra saw the danger and touched Eric's arm. Use the flare, she said. She remembered a maneuver Eric had shown her earlier. Eric nodded. He hit a button and a bright flare ejected from the back of the ship. The fighters turned toward the light, leaving the ship's tail open. Eric dove sharply, and they slipped away. They were safe for now, but Eric knew more fighters would come. He checked their course. They were near the system's edge, where a hidden asteroid field lay. He pointed to it. If we hide there, they won't find us. Lyra leaned forward, reading the map. Yes, she said. Eric steered toward the field. The fighters chased them, firing occasionally. The ship rocked, but the shields held. Eric's hands moved fast, guiding the ship through the rocky maze. Lyra watched as boulders flew past the window. She held on tight. She saw a large rock ahead and shouted, Left! Eric turned. They zoomed past the rock by inches. Lyra breathed hard. Good job, Eric said. They found a narrow tunnel between two massive asteroids. Eric guided the ship inside, and they turned off the engines. The ship drifted in darkness. Lyra held Eric's hand. Quiet returned. Eric checked the sensors. No fighters. He sighed. Safe. Lyra smiled and hugged Eric. The two sat together, looking out at the stones reflecting starlight. After a few minutes, Eric reached for the radio. No response. He turned off the shields to save energy. The silence felt heavy. Lyra spoke softly. What now? Eric thought. He looked at his map. They were far from the human fleet and deep in enemy space. He traced a route to the next star system, where an old relay station might help them signal home. We go there, he said. We repair the then we will be safe, Lyra nodded. She helped Eric power up the engines and shields. He gently guided the ship out of the asteroid field. Outside, the fighters had not followed. Eric hoped they thought the ship was gone. He set course for the relay station. The trip took hours. Eric and Lyra ate a small meal and rested. Lyra leaned on Eric's shoulder as he slept for a while. She looked at him, her heart full of care. When Eric woke, they were near the relay station. A tall steel tower orbited a nearby planet. It looked old and rusted. Eric smiled. We made it, he said. He guided the ship to dock. Lyra joined him, and they worked together to enter the station. Inside, the air was stale. Panels were dusty and cables hung loose. Eric led Lyra to the main console. He opened it and checked the circuits. Lyra handed tools as Eric tightened wires and replaced damaged parts. She watched every move, learning from Eric. The station's lights flickered on. Eric typed commands on the keyboard. A green light flashed. Power. Restored. Eric spoke into the mic. Human fleet, this is Eric Lane. I need pickup. Coordinates sending now. They waited. The station beeped, then responded with static. Eric smiled. Received. The voice said, hold position. Help is coming. Lyra jumped and cheered. Eric laughed and hugged Lyra. They sat on the floor of the station, relieved. Lyra rested her head on Eric's chest. He stroked her hair. Lyra spoke softly. Thank you. Eric kissed her forehead. We did it together. They watched the station lights and held each other. The stars were bright outside and their future was open. Eric thought of home but saw he had found a new home with Lyra. Moments later, outside the station, 2 human ships appeared. They docked at the station and people rushed in. A group of soldiers and crew came to help Eric and Lyra. The lead officer, Captain Ward, greeted Eric. Good to see you alive, soldier. Eric smiled. Good to see you too. The captain looked at Lyra. He nodded, understanding the bond between them. Welcome aboard, he said. Eric helped Lyra from the station. She smiled at the humans who stared but did not judge. They led Eric and Lyra to the waiting human ship where a small cabin had been prepared. Inside, Lyra looked at the bed and the table. She saw food and blankets. She sat down, still amazed. Eric closed the door behind them. Rest, Eric said. Tomorrow, we start a new life. Lyra nodded and lay down. Eric turned off most of the lights, leaving a soft glow. Eric sat by the window, watching the stars. Lyra's breathing was slow and calm. Eric thought of the journey that had brought him here, the crash, the repairs, the dangers, the bond with Lyra. He whispered, I care for you, Lyra. Lyra turned in her sleep and smiled. She whispered back without words. Her hand finding his. Eric knew they faced many challenges ahead, cultural differences, the war, their place in 2 worlds. But with Lyra at his side, he felt ready for anything. The ship moved through space, carrying them toward home. Lyra and Eric rested together, ready for new adventures beyond the stars.